everyone. Welcome to the fourth conversation of a series based on the book Transforming Language and Literacy Education, New Materialism, Posthumanism, and Ontoethics. My name is Diane Dagenais, and I have the great pleasure to meet with Magali Forte and Monica Waterhouse today. In the periods of confinement during the pandemic, books and stories have become a powerful way for many to not feel so alone. When we have access to it, technology has also allowed us to connect with others and see people, at least virtually. As co-editors of the book, Gilles, Suzanne, Magali, and I decided to start this series of conversations with the wonderful contributors who added their voices and their stories to our book, because we think access to recorded conversations such as this one provide great companions to the chapters they've written. Today, we're participating in this conversation from different places in the world. Magali and I are in Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada, and Monica is joining us from Quebec City in Quebec, in Canada. So before we get started and introduce each participant in the conversation, I'd like to thank the Faculty of Education Research Hub at Simon Fraser University for the technical support they provided for this conversation series. And now we'll begin with a land acknowledgement, which is part of our commitment to supporting linguistic and cultural diversity and working for more socially just educational approaches in our research, teaching, and lives as settlers. At Simon Fraser University, we acknowledge that we live, learn, and teach on the unceded, ancestral, and occupied lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, and Katzie nations of the Coast Salish people.
Thank you, Jen. Hello, everyone. So the book called Transforming Language and Literacy Education, New Materialism, Posthumanism, and Ontoethics, just to give you a bit of background, was published in June of 2020, so a year ago already. It would not have appeared without the thought-provoking contributions of several respected researchers and teacher educators, such as Monica Waterhouse, who is joining our conversation today. So thank you, Monica, for agreeing to chat with us about your chapter entitled Affect Theory as a Lens on Teacher Thinking in Adult Language Classrooms. And just before we begin our conversation, I would like to introduce Diane Dagenais, my co-host today, a co-editor of the book and my fabulous mentor and supervisor. So Diane Dagenais is professor in the Faculty of Education at Simon Fraser University, where she teaches in French and English language education. Informed by new materialism and posthumanism, her recent research in applied linguistics documents encounters of multilingual learners, digital tools, and literacy practices in and out of school.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, I should say. I really appreciate the invitation, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you, if only virtually.
Yes,
absolutely. And I'll introduce Magali. Magali Forte is a doctoral research assistant in the Faculty of Education at Simon Fraser University, as well as a French immersion teacher in Vancouver. Her research, funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, is a study in which she adopts a socio-material perspective, putting to work post-humanist, new materialist, and deleuzoguattarian theories in order to examine identity in a different way in multilingual education settings. And doing so, she acknowledges and contributes to learn about the rich Indigenous perspectives that are informing her work. And our guest today, Monica Waterhouse, is associate professor in the Département de langue, linguistique et traduction at Université Laval in Quebec City, Canada, where she teaches courses in research methodology, critical perspectives on culture and language education, and English language pedagogy. Her most recent research project, supported by the Fonds de Recherche du Québec, works with the Deleuzian concept of affect to study the social and curricular stakes of language learning in newcomer language programs and to explore the potential of arts-based pedagogies in these contexts. So I'll ask the first question. Monica, in your chapter, you mentioned that you first became interested in the materialist philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari as a doctoral student while working in an ESL conversation group as the leader. And this group included adult newcomer students. You explain that Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy immediately engaged you, and that you found, and I quote, their conceptual repertoire and associated epistemological assumptions extremely helpful for thinking about experiences in adult immigrant language programs. So can you speak more about it and which concepts in particular drew your attention and why?
Yes, thanks for the invitation. And I have to say, reflecting on some of the questions that you sent along ahead of time was a really interesting process for me to look at the way my thinking has evolved and hasn't evolved, perhaps over the years. But I have to say that those initial explorations, which were due in large part to my wonderful thesis supervisor at the time, Diane Dagenais at the University of Ottawa, were what first exposed me to Deleuze and Guattari. And I think in terms of concepts, the first one that really grabbed me was the notion of becoming. This sort of unpredictable transformation and continual movement of life. And although it might seem like a philosophical concept a bit apart from a second language classroom where I was a researcher practitioner, I was really struggling at the time, and honestly, maybe still today, with some of the fundamental ontological contingency of classrooms. As a teacher educator, we spend a lot of time teaching techniques and strategies for teaching. So we give this kind of idea that if you go into a classroom and do teaching practice X, then Y learning will magically happen. And in my experience, it often wasn't the case. And at moments really took off on what Deleuze and Guattari might call a line of flight that disrupted the entire classroom, the teacher, the other students in the room. And so I think that was one of the moments that the very first moment that brought me to that I shared in the chapter. So that notion of becoming and the contingency of life to intervene in classroom events was really the first entry point for me to this kind of thinking. Secondarily, I think rhizome was really important. Interestingly enough, the rhizome seems to be the most accessible concept in the Deleuze-Guattarian repertoire. If you find someone working with Deleuze and Guattarian education, rhizomes are usually in there somewhere. But for me, rhizomes became not just a way to think about connections happening unexpectedly in the classroom in practice, but also a way to rethink what's going on in research. So I didn't create this, but I know Diane Dagenais published rather extensively moving forward about how we might rethink what research is about through the notion of rhizoanalysis, where analyzing data is less about interpreting what's there, but rather seeing what connections can be made in the data and what that might do and what other connections might be made. So I think that was sort of, for me, one of the early movements towards what we maybe take for granted in post-qualitative work now. But at the time, I mean, this was back around 2006. We weren't there yet. No one was naming post-qual at that time as much. So this was kind of sometimes met with a bit of eyebrow raising, maybe in my dissemination activities. So yes, becoming and rhizome were probably the two that jumped out, and they remain important features in my work, but I've sort of shifted my emphasis maybe a little bit, which we can talk about more as we go forward.
Can I ask a follow-up question
Sure.
to that? Or actually, it's more of a statement than a question, but really your work with your colleagues at l'Université d'Ottawa and with Diane Dagenais, you're really pioneers in this area in language education and in education more generally. And I can see how you would have felt really alone in the beginning as a group. And now that you see all this interest growing in post-qualitative research and in deleuzoguattarian philosophy more generally, it must be really exciting and heartwarming for you.
I mean, it is in the sense that certainly in dissemination activities, whether it be in publication or whether it be at conferences, I actually have an audience at conferences now, which is sort of exciting. I have spoken to a few nearly empty rooms. I've had a few people walk out when they went, "The what?" and they left. And now it's much more known. So yes, it is nice. I don't know if that's too much academic ego, but it's nice to have that work validated, but also to have people to talk to outside of our own circle about these ideas. Certainly the group at Simon Fraser has been wonderful, and it's so productive to think with others and not to just be isolated and getting a little stuck in your own head.
Thank you. And it's been, I have to say, as a doctoral student, it's been very inspiring for me, and I'll use the word nice to find, you know, like literature that I can really engage with and that really interests me and that I find very relevant. And working with Diane as well, obviously, I have that support, and that means a lot to me as a doctoral student to have the freedom to explore these bodies of theories that, as you said, you know, like when you were talking about the mid 2000s, end of the 2000s, that's not that long ago for research. So it's really wonderful, and I'm joining Diane in her delight to read your work.
I should say too, Magali, on that point, I mean, it's wonderful to explore and see how it works, but I think too, these kinds of theories, you have to really make sure theory works, that you can do something with it in relation to the problems you're up against. And for me, that issue of the contingency of the classroom, this was super useful. But I would never suggest that, you know, we've got it right and everyone ought to jump on this theoretical or conceptual bandwagon, because it only works for certain kinds of problems. So I'm a big fan of, years ago, Patty Lather talked about paradigm proliferation is a good thing to think with. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, this is one way to look at the world, and it helps us engage with some problems. But I think, as we might get to later in the discussion, it doesn't necessarily respond to all problems. So we have to be really careful about how excited we get about our own theoretical positionings.
Thank you for saying that. I agree with you. And I love that phrase, the contingency of life intervening in classrooms, and certainly in language classrooms. I think that that's an appropriate kind of environment to adopt that lens, like you said. And speaking of lenses and of, you know, you mentioned the post-qualitative turn that has happened, and that's one way of referring to what's happening. And also, if we go back to the bodies of theories, now we hear the terms new materialism, posthumanism. And at the beginning of this chapter, well, we in this book, first of all, we have both new materialism and posthumanism in the title of the book. But in your chapter specifically, at the beginning, you mention about that you were both pleased and surprised by the invitation to contribute to a book mobilizing new materialist and posthumanist theories in language and literacy education, partly because, and I'm quoting you, you had not explicitly characterized your research with adult immigrant second language learners, theoretically framed by deleuzoguattarian affect theory, as situated within new materialist frameworks. And certainly reading more of your work, you know, we've noticed that you mentioned using a materialist lens, relying on materialist theory, identifying as a materialist theorist, or adopting a materialist stance in your research. So I'm just wondering, because I'm myself as a doctoral student exploring, you know, my own positioning, reflecting on it and trying to better define it, to acknowledge who it is that I am as a researcher. I'm wondering if you would say that your positioning has changed over the past few years since these texts were published. Would you define your research as new materialist? And finally, is it important, in your opinion, to be explicit about the difference between all these labels, whether they're materialist, new materialist, posthumanist, socio-material, or others?
Yeah, that's a really great and somewhat fraught question you pose, Magali. I do think that positioning yourself is important. And of course, as a doctoral student, you are required to do that. I think it's a very important thing to do in order to help you know how you fit into the field. And I also think these various terms, materialist, new materialist, posthuman, et cetera, certainly there's some basic tenets that they share in common. But as I was thinking about this, I think too, their emphasis and their focus might be a little different. I'm much more inclined to say my work is materialist because I'm really interested in materials in classrooms and not just humans, to try to understand what's happening in different teaching and learning situations that are going on. But then I notice posthumanism perhaps has stronger affiliations with work in, let's say, cybernetics and technology, right? To take a step back from the human, or in animal humane rights research, where decentering the human is a key aspect of what they're doing. So I think we have to be really as precise as we can be in our thinking, and to not be sloppy in conflating terms, because I think there certainly are nuances within these different terminologies that we have to be cautious about without getting into them all now. I'm a little embarrassed, if I'm quite honest, when you pointed out to me how frequently in my recent publications I have used the label materialist. And the funny thing is, I'm not really that wed to it. It's really, if I'm honest, a strategic dissemination choice. As we were discussing earlier in the conversation, I really see my work as informed by Deleuze and Guattari and by their conceptual repertoire. I've worked with them for many years. And it wasn't until around 2015, I would say, that people started reaching out to me and saying, oh, hey, you do materialist work. Would you like to be part of this materialist project or that materialist project? And I will admit that initially I went, I'm a what? Come again? And I had to look and find out why I was materialist in my thinking. And I think certainly Deleuze and Guattari fit under this larger conceptual umbrella. They can be considered materialist in many aspects of their thinking, and also in their ontology. But the label kind of came after the work. And I have taken it up because it helps to make what I'm doing intelligible to others. For example, someone who's maybe working with Baradian forms of material and post-human thinking, or Brie-Dottie or Cooley-McFrost, or anybody. If they haven't read Deleuze and Guattari, they may not make those connections immediately, right? So labels have a way of helping us make sense of the world, and human brains seem to really like categories and labels, like, oh, I understand what you are because you have that label. So I have rather shamelessly taken that up in a number of publications. But I think I remain conceptually fairly close to my original, my initial work, and trying to stay close to the Deleuzoguattarian version of the perspectives that I'm using. And are they important? Oh, yes, they're important. They really are important. And I have to thank both the group at Simon Fraser and also at UBC during my sabbatical in 2019. I was out there in June, and I think it becomes very clear that these labels are also very political. And I was taken to task a little bit, rightly so, for my rather myopic focus on Deleuze and Guattari's repertoire, certainly by Magali at the time and others, by not acknowledging indigenous forms of materialism. And this notion of new materialism is kind of, there's a tension there, of course, because from indigenous perspectives, there's nothing new about this. So that definitely is important. These labels matter in terms of our work, our thinking, and also in terms of our ethics, and helping us reflect on what Kubota recently called, it's so good, our epistemological racism that sort of blinds us to some perspectives in academia and others are foregrounded, and why is that? So those are important questions to be asking.
Thank you. I so appreciate your openness towards that. And I really, really enjoyed our conversations when you were here as well. And I have to say that for me, it was, I noticed that because I really enjoy reading your work, but also I find it very inspiring that you've found that, and I've working on my own thesis right now. I've also been thinking with your doctoral thesis, which is amazingly well organized and has been very generative for me. And from the beginning, I think that that's one thing that I really appreciate in your work. And as Jen was saying, I really never hesitate to share it with students when I'm given a course, or because it's so, again, clear in the sense that you adopt, and there's really this line that we can follow that that brings us into your world, into how you think with deleuzoguattarian theory, that I really appreciate and enjoy.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, and kudos to you as well with the book, because I mean, I think the book as a whole does that. And it's an important thing to do because a lot of these concepts are a bit weighty and philosophical. And so working in language and literacy education, we really need to find a way to translate that into what does it really mean in a classroom. So this is not just a challenge for me, but it's also a challenge for others working in this perspective. And I find the collection that's come together in the book does a beautiful job of that. So it's a wonderful resource all around, me and my fellow contributors. Congratulations on your strong leadership in that regard.
Thanks.
On to me with another question. Is that okay, Magali? Yeah, great. So we're curious now about what concepts you've been thinking with since you wrote this chapter. What are you currently working on, for example?
Yeah, this is such an interesting question. And in the sense that reflecting on it, I mean, if I buy in fully to my ontology, right, we're all becoming every day. So presumably my thinking's moved a little bit, but those little microflexions are not that evident to me. And if I'm honest, I'm working in a fairly similar place with similar concepts. Part of that, I think, too, is just an effect of what the last 2 years have looked like for everybody. Oh, I neglected to mention earlier, I recently, last fall, took on the program director role for our teacher education program. And so I feel like all I've done for the last, year is pandemic problem solving.
Oh.
But the interesting thing is that this kind of material thinking and the capacity of life to intervene is always close by, right? Because we're living it every day. We see how our lives are disrupted, deterritorialized, completely transformed by this very interesting relation of a little tiny coronavirus with human bodies around the planet. Now, it remains to be seen as how we're going to re-territorialize, as Deleuze and Guattari would say. We're trying to move back to the new normal, but it won't be the same. So this is, I think these ideas are always with me, but in terms of my own research in language and literacy, there hasn't necessarily been a lot of time to move forward on these things as we are preoccupied by these pressing issues. That said, I am trying to, in the chapter, I talked about teacher responses to a vignette about an emotionally fraught moment in a classroom, and looking at how they responded to that, and then trying to think about or theorize their decision-making processes as not just a cognitive process, but an affective process. So I'm still right now returning to data from that same project where the teachers were invited to also offer their own story, their own vignette of this kind of event. So that's kind of where I'm at now. I'm in a rhizoanalytic process where I'm reading and engaging with these stories. We have 50 stories on the English side, and unfortunately fewer on the French side. Our FSL teachers gave us 6 stories. But these are the stories I'm engaging with, reading with my research assistants as we try to see what can happen as we engage with these texts in a rhizoanalysis.
Well, thank you. Well, of course, I can see why, you're still interested in the ideas that you've been working with, because they're fascinating and compelling, and certainly, we continue to be in the sort of a hopefully post-pandemic world, or wherever we're at right now. In some places, maybe post-pandemic for now, but we're still, these are emotionally fraught times, and so these concepts that you've been working with are, becoming and they really an affect, really such interesting ideas to be thinking about now, and we've seen it, we've seen it again as we respond to you were in our conversation before we started recording. You mentioned how the environment is helping us think about the power of affect, and how it affects us, and what the effects are, the mutual effects, how we affect the environment, how the environment affects us. And so
yes, we're not apart from that. And if others, I feel like there may be like this wave of material theorizing that has sort of been maybe growing in education, is only going to gain steam because the last few years have really reminded all of us of this particular aspect of our lives. And I think others may find it useful to think this way too. But anyway, we shall see.
Yeah,
what it does.
Yeah, we have no idea what's coming next.
No.
Okay, well, Magali, do you have another question too?
Well, time goes fast, and we're nearing the end of our conversation. So I was going to ask you, Monica, if there is anything that you'd like to bring up that we haven't had a chance to discuss before we close.
Well, to be honest, in your initial questions you had asked me about, are there shortcomings associated with this way of thinking? And it really struck me because this is exactly the moment I'm at. I'm at kind of a conceptual crossroads, I guess. And I don't know if shortcomings is the right word to use, but I do find, maybe it's just my own coming up against the limits of my own thinking and my own conceptual creativity within materialist frameworks. But in this moment, there are such pressing issues of social justice in front of us. For some context, I'm thinking under the influence of Suhanthi Matha's AAAL keynote, where she asked us, is a decolonizing applied linguistics possible? And really pushed us to think about what's our contribution in our work, what's our legacy in our work. And at the same time, in my director role in teacher education, the Quebec government has just released a new set of teacher competencies after 20 years, which are perhaps long overdue, which focus on the incorporation of Indigenous perspectives in teaching. And of course, we can't, it's so strange that the materiality of 215 and counting Indigenous child bodies is somehow moving us as Canadians, as a nation, in ways that, for some reason, the discourse of testimonials of residential school survivors never did. So that in and of itself is an interesting question. All of this allows us to see the importance of the material in our world. And I think this theorizing does a really good job at examining, critiquing how certain assemblages of bodies and material and discourse come together, how they function. It gives us ways to try and think differently, to try to act differently, but it doesn't give us any concrete direction. It never tells us, do this. And it may be horribly misguided. Now I'm thinking of Katie Strom. That's not very Deleuzian. But I have a strong desire to act, and to act with a concrete ontological move to a certain kind of future, a future that is more just. And I'm getting very frustrated with this contingency that initially drew me to this theorizing, this unknowability of what is to come, because I want to know and I want to be able to move in that direction. So I think that question around shortcomings, I don't know if this theorizing is going to help me, or I don't see yet how this theorizing can help me in our pursuit of social justice in a moment where we're so desperate for it. I don't know what you guys think about that, but this is kind of something that keeps me up at night these days.
Certainly. And I think that, like you, we attended the AAAL conference and discussed in our research team being also moved and really wanting to respond to those calls to action. And yeah, it's interesting because early on, when posthumanist and new materialist theory started to, I find, become more widely read, that was one of the biggest critique, which was, okay, so if we, and I'm just voicing the critiques that I've heard, and we've been working on providing a fair and respectful and humble response to them. And I think it's a valid question, but the question that we've been asked a lot, I find, is you mentioned that with posthumanism, a big kind of push is to decenter the human, and certainly in deleuzoguattarian theory with their ontological view of the world as well. But the question that was asked is if we, like, can we ethically decenter the human after struggling for so many years to say that the definition of who we say is human is unfair and is unequal and is inaccessible to so many people. So there are a lot of tensions around it. I agree with you. And
perhaps, and maybe at this moment, I have to say, I'll thank you. I recently was reading your interview, your intraview, your collective interview from, I think it was the spring, maybe April last year, with Zambales on this very subject and the compatibility of post-human theorizing with decolonizing projects. And so certainly maybe listeners to this particular conversation might like to go and see that, to sort of explore that tension a little bit more. I found it very helpful, although I'm still sitting in a pretty uncomfortable place with it, but it's something to think with and to consider as we move forward with our work.
I think Magali Forte would like that you said you're sitting in an uncomfortable place with it. That's his whole thing, pedagogies of discomfort and really, sitting in discomfort, which we're not used to do because it is uncomfortable and that's not where we want to go. But I think it's, in some ways, to me, I like that you brought that up because it intersects with that idea of deterritorialization that's central to the deleuzoguattarian work, of really going outside of the territories that we're comfortable with. So
for sure,
rich bodies of theory to explore.
And continuing to question where we're positioning ourselves and how we're viewing the world, I think is, really important to continue to do. And well, Monica, thank you so much for this wonderful interview and the opportunity to talk about your chapter. And I hope the summer in Quebec City continues to be manageable, and that you enjoy your vacation ahead of you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll have lots to think about during it, and I appreciate the opportunity. It's been a real injection of energy to my thinking, and we'll see what that brings next year as I move into my research.
Thank you so much for the time you've given us today. Yes.
Thank you.